Naruto holds a place in the hearts of millions. It saw immense success and was even crowned as one of the big three anime for dominating the medium at the time. But Naruto has long since ended. It's been replaced by a spin-off called Boruto, which is doing fine, but the Naruto title and its impact on a generation of anime fans is irreplaceable. Such popularity inevitably expands the series into new types of entertainment, like, say, video games, where you can now play as the characters you've been watching this entire time. Fighting games are a particularly suitable genre for an action-packed series like Naruto, and there are many Naruto fighting games out there, but one series of Naruto fighting games is far more popular than all the others. The Ultimate Ninja Storm series began in 2008 as an extension of the Ultimate Ninja series that began in 2003. The developers, CyberConnect 2, made it clear that the first Storm game was about removing the boundaries between anime and video game and, as IGN puts it,
the main goal of Ultimate Ninja Storm is to bring all the slick action of the Naruto series to people of all skill levels. The result is a very approachable fighting game that uses a simpler control scheme to pull off awesome looking moves.
In other words, it was designed to be simple and easy, a casual fighting game. However, as the series progressed, CyberConnect 2 began to care more and more about creating a fighting game that is competitively viable. By the time of Naruto Shippuden and Ultimate Ninja Storm Revolution, the CEO of CyberConnect 2, Hiroshi Matsuyama, had this to say about the game.
我々思ってる以上に対戦ゲームとはいえですね、クリアした後にネットで戦う人っていうのはそんなに実はやっぱ多くなくて。
Here's the thing though, I've spent over a decade in the fighting game community. I've been on the forums, I've traveled and played in tournaments, and I've met hundreds of players. I'm engrossed in the scene, borderline raised in it, so I know damn well the fighting game community doesn't see Ultimate Ninja Storm as a fighting game. I haven't even seen this game at a tournament, like once. Not once have I ever seen this game at a tournament. I'm being serious, I've seen the fighting game community play rhythm games, puzzle games, sports games, and even Beyblade, but never Ultimate Ninja Storm. What's the deal? Why does this fighting game, under one of the biggest IPs in anime, receive no attention from the fighting game community? Well, it's an arena fighter. Arena fighters are a subgenre of fighting games known for having 3D environments that characters can freely move around in, as opposed to the more restricted movement of traditional 3D fighters. But the fighting game community doesn't take arena fighters seriously, and for good reason. This subgenre has an ugly history. So many arena fighters are low-effort cash grabs, while the few decent ones out there often don't meet the standards of a competitive fighting game. Skill and decision making often take a backseat to straight button mashing. It's pretty much expected of the fighting game community, who historically haven't been very open to different fighting game formats, to give a game like Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm no real attention. It's an arena fighter, it's not worth your while. Even though the Storm series is one of Bandai Namco's best sellers, a fighting game tournament is more likely to have people playing Clash of Ninja 4, a game that was released in 2005 instead of Storm. Clash of Ninja is more in line with what a competitive fighting game is expected to look like, alongside having the credibility of being developed by A-Team, the same developers behind popular fighting game community titles such as Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, and Dungeon Fighter Duel. The most attention I've ever seen this game receive from anything to do with the fighting game community was when Bandai Namco Esports paid popular fighting game commentators, Sejam and Tasty Steve, to commentate in a couple of tournaments shortly after the game was released. The pair were entertaining, as always, but it was clear that Storm isn't a game they're very familiar with.
It's definitely one of the better assists anyway.
Yeah, any of the big fireball assists like Itachi, Sasuke take up so much space on the screen. It's a Matarasu, like maybe?
Yeah, it's a Matarasu.
And then he has Almighty Push with Nagato.
The fighting game community won't acknowledge competitive Storm, but Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm does have a dedicated competitive scene. There are players constantly pushing the meta, cash prize tournaments being run, and there's even a community mod players use to make the game more competitive. I spent my teenage years playing many of the different Storm games, but I never viewed the series as competitive. After all, I was playing it alongside games that had a larger, and to be frank, noticeable competitive scene, like Guilty Gear. Even without those games to focus on for a competitive outlet, the mechanics of Storm were so detached from what is typically valued in a competitive fighting game that I assumed the series was disqualified from ever having a real competitive scene anyway. What's up guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to do the pre-Shippuden Naruto BNB. To make the combo easier to learn, I'm just going to do a live notation side by side of the combo. Right, so let's do this. And there you have it. But recently, I went back to the Storm series. It's not like I wanted to play it, I just wanted to see what the latest Storm videos on YouTube looked like. I was pleasantly surprised to find a community that made competitive Ultimate Ninja Storm actually look competitive, and fun too. I'm not gonna say that the game was secretly great all along just because players made themselves a competitive scene. People will do that for just about anything because competition itself is fun. I don't think Ultimate Ninja Storm is the new Smash Bros of the fighting game community, where it's disrespected and branded a party game despite having a tremendous amount of depth. Arena fighters are not the new platform fighters. However, I think Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm is a fun and competitive fighting game. As I said before, I don't ever see this game at competitive fighting game events, even as a side tournament. The stigma around arena fighters in the fighting game community is huge and kind of deserved. But should its status as an arena fighter really be enough to make everyone avoid it? We had bloody Catherine at EVO. Catherine! And the reason they had it there was because it was a fun side game. Why not have it? Storm players don't necessarily need the fighting game community either, and they don't seem desperate to cement their place within it. They're happy playing a game they like, and it makes me happy to see how far they've taken the game. But I love fighting game tournaments, and I really liked the Storm series growing up. I just want to thoroughly understand what it is about the Storm series that stops it from having a place in the fighting game community, without simply dismissing it as, it's an arena fighter, therefore it's worthless. What we're going to do in this video is take a deep dive into the series, analysing the mechanics of each game and how competitive they've been. By the end of this video, you'll be able to understand what's happening during a high-level Storm 4 match. We'll see how the Ultimate Ninja Storm series developed over the years into a game that managed to birth its own competitive scene. And trust me, it developed a lot, because the first Ultimate Ninja Storm game was, well, let's get into it. It is with extraordinary confidence that I can tell you, Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 1 is not a competitive fighting game. I would hesitate to even call it a fun fighting game, though at the time I'm sure it was. First, a brief description of this series' staple mechanics. Everyone has 4 different combo strings, but they're all performed by continuously hitting one button while holding a chosen direction. Like most fighting games, you have your health gauge and your meter gauge, or as it's called in this game, the chakra gauge. The chakra gauge is how you'll perform many of your more powerful moves. Jutsus, for example, are a character's unique special move that costs a decent chunk of chakra. Ultimate jutsus are like super moves that cost an even bigger amount of chakra. You'll also use your chakra gauge for chakra dashes and chakra shurikens, which is basically the universal projectile. At the bottom of the screen are your ninja tools. They're not majorly important, but they're decently useful items with varying purposes, like a speed or damage buff, or some delayed kunai explosion. They're also the reason you shouldn't play this game with an arcade stick, since you access these items with the D-pad. In the Storm series, you'll also have supports that aid you in battle by jumping in with their own jutsu when you call them. In this game, you're required to have at least one support, and you can have up to 2. In later games, 1v1 battles are possible, but fighting with supports is pretty integral to the Storm series. Okay, with that out of the way, I just have to mention, this game is so beautiful, especially for its time. Even as I strain to play this game in 2022, I can clearly feel the love and creativity that the developers put into this game. Look at these beautiful ultimate jutsus. Unfortunately though, the mechanics suck. The first major issue with the gameplay is the neutral. Neutral in Ultimate Ninja Storm 1 is a myth. There's all this area to move around in, but trust me, this neutral lacks any depth. You have this 3-dimensional plane to work with, but it's completely filler. You just meaninglessly run around in it until one player chakra dashes at the other. Chakra dash is a homing dash that costs a little bit of chakra. If you know about Dragon Ball FighterZ, it's quite similar to Super Dash. This is your only sane approach option since it's supremely better than everything else and doesn't cost much to use. It's also near impossible to sidestep, whereas everything else in this game is ludicrously easy to sidestep. Chakra Dash is a series staple that is still around in the most recent game, but the issue with it in this game is how powerful it is. There is little counterplay against Chakra Dash. It goes right through regular projectiles, so the only way of stopping it is with powerful, costly jutsus like a literal fireball jutsu. But even that's basically impossible. Chakra Dash has virtually no startup frames and travels incredibly fast, whereas a jutsu has a lot of startup frames before any hitbox is active. Nobody can counter Chakra Dash with a jutsu on reaction, so if you want to beat Chakra Dash, your jutsu needs to be preemptive by a good margin. And you thought Dragon Ball FighterZ Super Dash was bad. As far as counterplay goes, this is the least enjoyable kind. It has little to do with understanding and outplaying your opponent and more to do with getting lucky on a guess. And another reason you should just hit Chakra Dash is because even if the opponent guards it, you have no recovery and immediately start your turn anyway, which is pretty damn ridiculous. If you're familiar with the concept of risk-reward in fighting games, I can assure you that it doesn't exist here. Chakra Dash is very little risk but gives you all the reward. This is your neutral. Chakra Dash. It doesn't get any deeper than that. There's no effective counterplay. If you're busy thinking of Chakra Dashing, you're doing it wrong. Just Chakra Dash your way to victory. I promise it'll work. Speedrun the neutral into close quarters combat. And speaking of which, the close quarters combat isn't very good either. Offense and defense are boring because your decision making has no influence on it. Offense here is simply mashing auto combos, which, contrary to popular belief, isn't the case in later games. Defense is almost the same, it's functionally just button mashing, but it's particularly evil for fooling everyone into believing that better mashing equals better defense when the truth is it's all luck. I'll explain. Defensive options in Storm games are nothing like what you see in other fighting games. Here's where I'll introduce another series staple. It's called substitution, and it's truly pathetic in this game. Substitution is a technique that is available to you when you're in hit stun or guarding. When you substitute, you'll teleport behind your opponent. If you're far away, you'll teleport upwards, but that doesn't really matter since you almost always want to use substitution when you're getting melee attacked. This is your only way of escaping a melee auto combo. You'll be relying on this as your singular lifeline against Chakra Dash into combos, but it's an awful lifeline to be stuck with, because substitution is performed by pressing guard or the left shoulder button right before a move hits you. And you know, I've seen similar timing-based mechanics in fighting games before, and it works in other games because it feels consistent no matter how tight the timing may be. In Ultimate Ninja Storm, getting a successful substitute is ridiculously inconsistent, and you'll find no success in intentionally fishing for one. Like, the timing to activate substitution might be literal RNG. I genuinely don't know, but at this point, I think it might be RNG. I wouldn't be surprised if it were. You're 100% better off mashing both substitution buttons as fast as possible. Sometimes that'll work, but sometimes you'll be left to helplessly watch your character eat a full combo, wondering why the substitution gods ignored your call. But if you can substitute, so can your opponent. When you substitute and start hitting them, they'll substitute and start hitting you. Then you'll substitute again and start hitting them again. Then they'll substitute again and start hitting you again. That's the loop here. I've gotta say, it looks a bit funny when this substitution relay is happening, but as a gameplay feature, it's poorly implemented. Even if it technically requires input from the player and technically tests their timing, the mechanic feels automatic. There is no point during hitting an opponent or being hit by your opponent that you're making a real decision here. On both ends, there are no options to consider. You needn't consider that the opponent might substitute your combo because you have no counterplay against it anyway. Almost every attack button has large recovery frames and no cancel options, so you have no way of defending yourself from a substitution followed by an attack. Substitution is also a shockingly low chakra cost, so you may as well just press the buttons. The obstacle in your way isn't whether or not the opponent can predict it, but whether you can mash hard enough to get it to work. Which is boring. It's boring because you're not fighting the opponent, you're fighting the mechanics. Garbage design. This is not a competitive fighting game. Chakra Dash and Substitution make that clear enough, but I assure you, there are other mechanics present that hinder this game's chances at competitive viability, like ultimate jutsus. These aren't difficult to land, which is a strange decision by itself. There are times where I'll be playing and then suddenly I'm in an ultimate jutsu clash without even realizing how it hit me. The actual challenge kicks in after someone lands an ultimate jutsu, because then a clash begins. You and your opponent have to outmash each other to a sequence of random buttons. If you land an ultimate jutsu but lose the mash fest to your opponent, the cutscene ends prematurely and you don't get the damage. On the other hand, if you win the mash fest, you'll get the full damage and a beautiful cutscene. The ultimate jutsu clash is the only justification I can think of for letting some of these jutsus hit so easily, but the clash itself is a bad idea. I don't hate the idea of mashing to get out of things, although I think a lot of the fighting game community does, but I'm not exactly an advocate for it either. This just feels awful. In my eyes, Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 1 has next to no competitive merit. Then there's Ultimate Ninja Storm 2.
This world shall know pain.
Naruto, hurry! Naruto!
A fun fact about this one is that Lars from Tekken 6 is part of the roster, and because of this, Lars Tekken will forever be on the Naruto wiki. A 2010 interview with the president of CyberConnect 2, Hiroshi Matsuyama, reveals why Lars is even here. He said, "I saw an article in the Shonen Jump magazine in Japan which said that Kishimoto-sensei was designing the costume for Lars for the console versions of Tekken 6. The moment I saw that article, I thought, it would be great to see him in Storm 2. Then I saw the costume design for Lars and my thoughts changed to, we have to get him in Storm 2. In Bandai Namco's announcement that Lars will be part of the roster, they said that Lars brings his explosive signature moves to the game's versus mode, which will add new depth and dimension to the overall experience. Well, this is obvious PR word salad, but is there new depth and dimension to Storm 2? Storm 2 did make changes that signify a step in the right direction. First, Chakra Dash. There's now a few frames of startup to Chakra Dash, which is appreciated against such a strong approach tool with excellent tracking. The jutsus a person may use to try and beat Chakra Dash now have more time to actually come out. Players are also now given more time to react to Chakra Dash with a guard, which has also changed. If you guard Chakra Dash, you and your opponent now bounce away from each other and reset to neutral. This doesn't fix everything. Unless you're as predictable as a training dummy and the opponent keeps hitting you with a jutsu, Chakra Dash is still very low risk and there's little reason not to spam it. However, at least now guarding a Chakra Dash doesn't instantly put you in a disadvantageous situation. This change was the first step to fixing the Chakra Dash and is a huge improvement over what it was before. But it's still very bad. The second change I'll quickly highlight is with the ultimate jutsus. They're now a lot more akin to your traditional fighting game supers. Attempting one will immediately cost a good chunk of chakra gauge, and when you do it, there is now a screen freeze, or what the fighting game community more commonly knows as a super flash, to warn the opponent that a powerful attack is coming. And finally, if you successfully hit the ultimate jutsu, that's it. There's no longer a mashing minigame to determine whether the ultimate jutsu will fail or not. I think this way of implementing ultimate jutsus functions a lot better. Landing an ultimate jutsu is now determined by whether you can create an opening for it, as opposed to the biggest determining factor being how good you are at mashing that day, like it was before. These were decent gameplay adjustments that indicated that CyberConnect 2 cared at least a bit about improving the mechanics for a more enjoyable game. It was a start, but they still tripped themselves up by leaving Substitution unchanged. For all the flaws Chakra Dash and Ultimate Jutsus either had or still do have, neither of them are as frustrating as Substitution. The biggest and most important brand new feature of Storm 2 is Support Drive. Supports do more than just use their jutsus now. Every time you call a support, your support drive gauge increases. Once it reaches a certain point and lights up, your support characters will perform additional actions depending on their support type. There are 3 types of supports: attack type, guard type, and balance type, and they each act differently when you've built enough of the gauge. Attack type now automatically hops in during your combos for extra hits to net extra damage, but more importantly, they now perform a strike back, a flashy combo extender that automatically activates whenever your opponent is knocked away. Guard types are human shields that magically appear in front of you whenever you're charging up chakra or when the opponent chakra dashes at you. Now, if any of you just assumed that this would work as an effective defense against chakra dash, you'd be absolutely right. This action is called Dash Cut, and it makes guard type supports incredibly valuable. Finally, balance types come in to throw kunai alongside you, which honestly never felt that useful, but more importantly, they'll take the hit of an ultimate jutsu for you at the cost of killing and removing them from the fight. Support types feel like CyberConnect 2's first attempt at introducing mechanical variety into the series. Variety is something that the fighting game community greatly values, but I'll elaborate on that a bit later. The amount of real variety in Storm 1 was incredibly low, with jutsu attacks being the only attack that is functionally unique between everyone, but even then, many of them functioned incredibly similarly. The attempt at some variety is pleasing to see, but unfortunately quite shallow. Support types and the additional features they bring to a match, in actuality, make next to no difference in how you'll play out a match, which is the real issue. You'll still be playing the same way everyone else is, and that makes for a boring fight. The mechanic is further undermined by its poor balancing. In-game, balance type supports are underpowered, which disqualifies it from ever being picked. Attack type Strike Back and guard type's Dash Cut are too valuable to justify having a balance type anywhere on your team, despite their ability to take the hit of ultimate jutsus for you or their cover fire. Seriously, look up online matches on YouTube and note the support types that people keep putting on their teams. But, you know, it's their first implementation of this entirely new mechanic. It's decent, and additional support functions are a cool addition to the Ultimate Ninja Storm series that aren't going to leave. I mean, the way attack type alters gameplay is especially fun. Now that you're rewarded for knocking the opponent back, you can now turn things like stray jutsu hits into full combos, which can be very fun to pull off. Guard type significantly alters gameplay as well, but my opinion on how it does this is mixed. I do like that it prevents the opponent from chakra dashing at you with little consequence. Since your support takes the dash for you, a careless chakra dash can actually have consequences. But I still think this is a bit too strong. It's lame that the support does this automatically without requiring any thought from the defender, but hey, even though I'm assessing the competitive viability of the game, I haven't forgotten that these games had to appeal to a wider casual audience. They definitely did a better job at that than most traditional fighting games I know, but in a video like this one, maybe that's not a good sign. Guard type supports are especially egregious when they're protecting a character while they charge up chakra, and this is solely egregious because of Awakening, a mechanic that I have yet to mention. It existed in Storm 1, but I didn't have much to say about it. From this game and on is where I think it's very important, so it's time to explain. That's only available to you once you're below 50% health, or somewhere near that. It actually varies by character. It's activated by filling your chakra gauge, then charging it past the limit into Awakening. This short time you spend charging into Awakening leaves you wide open, and that's the intent. If the opponent is paying attention, they have a fair opportunity at interrupting your attempts to enter Awakening, and this worked just fine in Storm 1. However, in Storm 2, bloody guard type supports want to get in the way of all your attempts at interrupting an Awakening charge, and oh my god, do they do it successfully. Combined with the fact that Awakenings are absolutely busted in this game, guard type supports are frustrating and obnoxious. Good luck fighting against these stupid super armored powerhouse fortresses that you have no shot at preventing.
Obliterate, then you I shall annihilate. Wham to the boom boom cat.
The next one will be huge!
But even through all this, Storm 2 was a great game for Naruto fans. When you're a casual, a mechanic like summoning the Susanoo mid-match is super exciting, unless you're on the receiving end of it. At this point, the series was still far and away from being taken seriously competitively. Adding a Tekken character was a nice attempt at trying to convince us, but substitution still roams free as if it isn't a criminal mechanic that is actively hurting Storm. Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 2 still has barely any competitive merit, but it's at least slightly better than the first game. On the bright side, this game still had a better story mode than pretty much every traditional fighting game ever. I know the gaming industry dislikes quick-time events now, but Storm 2 had fantastic action sequences in these quick-time events. Also, the music in this game is my favorite in the entire series. Composed by Chikaro Fukuda, many of these tracks you can find in this game are beautiful pieces. Listen to this. The following Storm game was not Ultimate Ninja Storm 3, but instead Ultimate Ninja Storm Generations. I can only assume that with a 3-year gap between Storm 2 and Storm 3, Generations was created in between so that the actual Naruto series had more time to advance the story before Storm 3 was made. If CyberConnect 2 had no choice but to make a side game, Generations was a good idea to go with. Much like Sonic Generations from the year prior, Ultimate Ninja Storm Generations was where young Naruto meets older Naruto in the same game. It was a fun concept, and an excuse to bring back all the younger characters and their movesets that people missed from Storm 1. Alongside the younger characters came some mechanical upgrades. Huge mechanical upgrades. Generations introduces what I consider to be the most important mechanical change in the entire series. This singular adjustment changed Ultimate Ninja Storm forever, transforming it from the funny Naruto party game you play with your school friends into a fighting game that holds the potential for real competitive viability. They reworked substitution. Praise the Naruto gods, because CyberConnect 2 finally addressed the infuriating nonsensical shit show that substitution was, and reworked it into something immensely better. The days of mashing and praying are dead. Now you'll have to use your substitutions wisely. And you know what? For this change alone, I'm gonna increase the bar right now. So, what's changed? Substitution previously worked by hitting either the guard or substitution button right before an attack hit you, but this timing was so inconsistent that you could almost never get this to work intentionally and would fare much better by mashing buttons until a substitution randomly occurred. No matter how good your mash was, this mechanic felt as though it was occurring completely independent of your own ability. In Generations, substitution occurs whenever you press the button, no timing required. It'll instantly happen when you press it at any moment during hit, stun, or guard, no caveats. But that's not all. Substitution no longer costs any amount of chakra. Instead, substitution now has its own gauge, seated beneath the chakra gauge. Although, unlike the chakra gauge, the substitution gauge is split into 4 blocks. Each time you substitute, it uses up 1 block. If you use up all 4 blocks of the substitution gauge, be prepared to eat a very damaging combo if you get hit. Of course, the substitution gauge does regenerate. Every time you use substitution, no matter how many blocks are left, it takes about 7 in-game seconds for the game to even begin the regeneration process, and about 9 in-game seconds before the gauge has finished regenerating a single block. On top of this, if you use another substitution before the regeneration process begins, it resets the timer, meaning you'll have to wait even longer for the regeneration process to begin. There are situations where your substitution gauge may be completely depleted while you're getting comboed. It's tempting to substitute out of a big combo the moment you see your first block regenerate, but this is a risky idea. If the opponent finds a way to hit you soon after your substitution, the timer resetting means you're a sitting duck, and soon to be a dead one at that. An often safer decision would be to take those extra hits for a few more seconds until your substitution gauge is fully regenerated. Then, even if you find yourself eating another combo soon after using a substitution, you'll at least have more substitutes to work with and be able to stay in the game. I believe that the reworking of substitution was the single most important change for the series, transforming it from just another arena fighter into one of the best there is. But it's still an arena fighter. I mean that in a good way because, again, CyberConnect 2 designed a fighting game that needed to appeal to a large audience of young Naruto fans. In that regard, substitution wasn't a huge problem. I could even argue that reworking it to be a smarter mechanic might alienate the casual players that'll go online, get destroyed, and not have a fun time at all. But this game is several years old. I don't need to make arguments, I can just tell you what happened, and what happened is that casual players still love the game. I appreciate the substitution rework so much because it didn't alienate casuals at all. This mechanic may be smarter, but it still isn't complex. In fact, it's far more intuitive than it was before. It didn't alienate casuals, and at the same time, it opened up a space that competitive players could occupy. With this change, bad defense and good defense are now things that exist in the series. But what about offense? The introduction of a new mechanic called Chakra Dash Cancel makes good offense a reality too. Chakra Dash Cancel allows you to cancel your combo strings at any point with a Chakra Dash. Chakra Dash cancelling costs a fair bit more chakra than a Chakra Dash in neutral, so it must be used with care, but it is well worth using. With this cancel, you're no longer wide open after your opponent substitutes out of one of your combos. In fact, you can actually punish them for using substitution. If an opponent substitutes your string and tries to do anything other than guard, a well-timed Chakra Dash cancel will punish anything that they try. The threat posed by a Chakra Dash cancel now means that substitution needs to be timed cleverly to remain unpredictable, on top of managing the resource well. One of the worst feelings while playing Storm is having your substitution read by an opponent. It was supposed to be a moment where you reverse the situation, but you find yourself in the exact same situation, except this time with less outs to work with. On the contrary, one of the best feelings in Storm is being the one to do this to someone else. These two big changes were fantastic for the world of offense and defense in Ultimate Ninja Storm. We went from mash and pray to manage resources. It's a whole different dynamic. Neutral has also changed. When a Chakra Dash is guarded, instead of both players bouncing backwards, it now only happens to the one who used the Chakra Dash. The one who guarded now has the frame advantage, and the one who dashed now needs to prepare for an attack. This is hugely different from what we had back in Storm 1. For the better. Predictable Chakra Dashes now leave you at a disadvantage, so you need to figure out how to mask your approach. Or at least, you would have needed to do that if they didn't go and introduce Air Chakra Dash. In Storm 1 and 2, Chakra Dash was something that could only be performed on the ground. Trying to perform it while airborne would just fast forward you to the ground and start the Chakra Dash there. As of Generations, you can perform Chakra Dashes while airborne. Ultimate Ninja Storm always had regular air dashes, but they were only useful as air combo extenders. They had poor tracking and were too slow to be used in neutral. However, Air Chakra Dash is several times faster than the regular air dash. Like the Chakra Dash of Storm 1, these Air Chakra Dashes have very little startup frames, making them incredibly hard to react to. Furthermore, jumping over a ground Chakra Dash and punishing it with an Air Chakra Dash of your own was now possible. Ground Chakra Dash was no longer risk-free, and because of this, Ultimate Ninja Storm's meta evolved to prioritize jumping and guarding as the best form of movement. At this point, the Ground Chakra Dash was significantly weaker than the Air Chakra Dash. You still couldn't act out of Ground Chakra Dash after it was initiated, so it was relatively unsafe. It traveled further than Air Chakra Dash, but that wasn't a good thing when you considered its slightly lengthy startup in combination with the fact that it could be properly punished now. It lost a lot of its usefulness. It lost more than I'd prefer, but this was ultimately a good thing. In Storm, neutral used to be two players chakra dashing at each other until one player caved. Generations gave players a reason to consider alternative approach options other than the ground chakra dash, and this was a huge step in the right direction for the series. We now have a semblance of offense, defense, and neutral, all in the changes made to one game. If anyone ever says that CyberConnect 2 didn't care at all about its competitive audience, please use this video to disagree. Generation still wasn't the perfect competitive game, far from it, but these design choices are too good and feel too intentional for me to agree with the accusation that CyberConnect 2 didn't care at all. Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm Generations has some competitive merit.
Yo, hey, ho! You know my force, of course, from the source, the remorse for me, the one and only killer bee. Watch and learn, feel a burn, testify, say goodbye, but I fly when I fight my guy. A hot-blooded fighter with his hair in a bowl, a fist full of passion and a kick full of soul, but I'll chew him up like a casserole.
That's it. The game has competitive merit. I didn't say it needed to be an amazing competitive fighting game, I just thought we needed to get to a point where the winner was determined by skill, rather than, you know, who was able to mash harder or who was lucky enough to have substitution come out more often. I mean, look, the fighting game community runs side tournaments for bloody Beyblade and Sailor Moon. I think that's evidence alone that I shouldn't be holding Ultimate Ninja Storm to some ridiculously high standard. But maybe I still need to. It's an arena fighter. Like I said, the stigma that carries is huge, and honestly, if the first two games are any indicator, that stigma is well deserved. So, I could go into the upcoming Storm games with the mission of trying to convince you that Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm is a good competitive fighting game that deserves a spot as some kind of side event at fighting game tournaments. But what's the point? What's the point in trying to give you an objective answer to a subjective thing? The reason it isn't at fighting game tournaments isn't only because of the stigma. Sometimes a game can be good competitively and you still just don't want to play it. The stigma stops it from being at fighting game tournaments because people don't give it a real chance. And that's why we're going to delve into the competitive scene of Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 later in the video. However, I'm not here to convince you whether it's a good competitive fighting game or not. From now on, I'm here to just explore the mechanics of Ultimate Ninja Storm and show you what kind of fighting game this is and show you the competitive scene it has. We're only halfway through this series of games though. I said before that you'd be able to understand what was going on during a high level Storm 4 match by the end of this video, and I've still got a few more mechanics I need to show you before we get to Storm 4. But before I shift the focus onto the next game in the series, I want to take this opportunity to address one of the differences between this game and other traditional fighters I've talked about on this channel. You know, besides the fact that they belong to entirely different subgenres. I want to talk about archetypes. Archetypes are integral to most traditional fighters. One of the cool things about fighting games is that every character plays differently from one another, all achieving victory in different ways. Sometimes there's slight crossover in the way two characters play, but there's also usually enough differences between them to let them feel unique. Ultimate Ninja Storm isn't great at this. I'm not saying that everybody plays the same, the game does have different archetypes. And furthermore, there's more uniqueness to a character than just their jutsu or tilt attack. Oh, I've actually yet to talk about tilt attacks. Every character has a tilt attack, performed by flicking the control stick and hitting the melee button. Unlike regular melee attacks that have a universal rule, like you hit the button and they do a small punch or something equivalent to that, tilt attacks vary greatly by character. There's no set purpose that a tilt attack needs to fulfill in a character's moveset. They can be, and often are, straightforward lunge type attacks, but they can also be projectiles, or a dodge, or a teleport. Anything that the developers come up with. Alongside jutsu attacks, they're the most unique part of a character's toolkit, and they're sometimes way more creative and interesting than the jutsus in the game. But even with tilt attacks in mind, the thing is, at a beginner and somewhat mid-level, a lot of characters function nearly identically to one another. For every truly unique jutsu a character has, there are 5 more characters with jutsus that aren't very unique. For every character defining tilt attack, there are 5 more characters with tilt attacks that don't really stand out. Out of the several video game genres out there, fighting games are one of the best at letting players fully embody fictional characters. You don't just wear the skin of the character and press away until you win the game, you learn the character inside and out. You learn their moveset, you learn what they're good at, and you learn what they're bad at. Then you follow these traits because you are wholly playing as that character. That's why it's upsetting to see so many of these Naruto characters play so similarly when, if you've watched the show, you know that a patient and strategic character like Shikamaru, who waits for his opponents to make fatal mistakes, has no business playing the same way as a straightforward character like Naruto. Harkening back to Persona, a good example of this is in how Arc System Works adapted the Persona 4 characters to the fighting game spin-off Persona 4 Arena. When you play the Persona 4 RPG, you spend about 100 hours with these characters and get to know their personalities. If you were to imagine how each character would approach a fight, their Persona 4 Arena selves are exactly that. Chie is explosive. She'd probably try to just kick the hell out of the opponent, which is what she does in Persona 4 Arena. Yukiko is more reserved, which is reflected in how she elegantly dismantles the opponent from a distance. Naruto is strategic and deductive, and Naruto's playstyle involves laying traps and catching the opponent when they slip up. Kanji is a straightforward guy, and he approaches a fight just how you'd expect him to, by just grabbing them. Teddy is a joke, and his gameplay is, fittingly, like watching a circus. This is one of the reasons Persona 4 Arena is an amazing fighting game. Fighting games should be taking that extra step. Don't just give the character a punch and a kick and call it a day. The way you think a character would approach a fight should be reflected in how they actually fight in-game. Like, Conan, why are you approaching them? Just turn the water into paper bombs. The characters of the Naruto series all have their different personalities that would be fantastic to see properly reflected in a fighting game. Unfortunately, the Storm series, and honestly, other official Naruto games too, aren't designed in a way that accommodates this kind of expression. They're affected by the need to appeal to a large casual audience, which likely is what encourages the gameplay of these characters to be designed in a simple and easy to pick up format. And yet, I still need to give some props to how Storm approached this subject. I know I just criticized the game for it, and these criticisms still apply, but they do get it right in a few instances with characters like Tamari, Tenten, Kankuro, and a few others. I've only shown off the melee characters throughout most of this video, but Ultimate Ninja Storm does have 2 other archetypes. The roster is still predominantly melee characters, but there are a few projectile characters such as Tenten, Shino, Tamari, Deidara, Kidomaru, the second Mizukage, and Utakata. The shuriken button is replaced with entire strings of projectiles on these characters, and their melee capabilities are intentionally subpar compared to the rest of the roster. They don't have multiple combos, and the single one that they do have that doesn't do much damage. It's clear that you're supposed to create an offense from a distance, but the problem with characters under this archetype is that they're terrible at their job. 1, they can't keep opponents at a distance because Chocodash easily cuts right through all of the projectiles. 2, most of these projectile strings aren't even true combos and the opponent can start guarding in the middle of them. 3, the tracking on these projectiles is so laughably bad that I can dodge everything by holding right on my analog stick.
Making my way downtown, walking fast, faces pass and I'm homebound.
Wait, people have been clowning on Tenten this whole time, but she was just trying to play the matchup. It's disappointing to see this archetype be so flawed. If Mei, a melee character, is in contention for best zoner in the game, you know there's a problem.
Speaking of her combos as well, actually, so the best part about Mizukage Mei, so what makes her so strong, is actually the fact that she, what she can do is that she can pressure with her IC3 from far. So her IC3 is her intro combo 3, so that's 1, 2, 3. That's basically what her IC3 is. This is amazing, because this stops chakra dashes and even stops some projectile jutsu. This makes Mei one of the best zoning characters in the game, probably if not the best zoning character in general.
The other archetype is puppet characters, of which there are 3. Kankuro, Sazori, and Chiyo. Yes, out of a roster of maybe 70 plus, there are 3 puppet characters. Blame the show. These characters are nothing like the puppets we're used to in traditional fighting games, where 2 characters are both attacking at once. In Ultimate Ninja Storm, the Puppet Master has 0 moves while the puppet, a melee character on strings, does all of the work. I'm drawn to these characters on account of how unique they are, but to be honest, they don't deliver either. Their appeal is that they can operate like a melee character from a safe distance, but as a consequence, they are completely defenseless if their puppet is knocked down. I'd always hoped that puppets could introduce some new dynamics into the match, but my unfortunate review of them is that they've never felt that unique in practice. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly aspects to them that only they can replicate, like keeping up full screen pressure while your opponent tries to escape the puppet, but this archetype looks more unique than they actually feel. And also, it's worth taking my review of them with a grain of salt because I'm not a high-level Storm player, and high-level Storm players probably have a lot more to say about puppets than I do. But regardless, it's disappointing to see these archetypes end up like this when they also represent some of the few instances of real variety in Ultimate Ninja Storm. Like other fighting games, dedicated players will make these characters work, but I wish you didn't have to be some ultra enthusiast just to make these characters work. Storm's experimentation with alternate archetypes is lacking, but I don't necessarily think it's a failure. I think this is a result of the type of game Storm has to be. There's an audience CyberConnect 2 needs to cater to. Even if they're under a different archetype, characters need to be easy to pick up. They need to be straightforward. Puppet characters do have a significantly higher skill floor than everybody else, but they don't take much effort to pilot at a basic level. They'll just feel like very bad characters to anyone who hasn't put the time into becoming a puppet master. They won't feel impossible to play. In contrast, the puppet characters of traditional fighting games scared me away for a long time because they required so much base knowledge before you were even slightly competent with them. This is just one of those things that happens because Ultimate Ninja Storm isn't like other traditional fighters. I like several different fighting game archetypes, so I wish Storm leaned into them more, but it doesn't need to. Storm is fun regardless. And I can assure you, there was more than enough fun to be had with the next game in the series.
Then I hereby declare war on you all. The 4th Great Ninja War.
What do I think of Storm 3?
It is the best game. Oh my god, I can't believe it. I mean, my hat's in the way the whole time, but if you play this game, you'll fall in love with it just like I did. I'm pre-ordering it right now.
Storm 3 is an amazing game. This series has always bettered the anime scenes that they recreate with new action sequences or new emotional beats, but Storm 3 brought so much to the table that other Storm games look mediocre by comparison. The campaign on offer here should be envied by other fighting games. This game spends its duration adapting the 4th Great Ninja War, an arc that lasts about 200 episodes of anime, but is only 2 days in universe. To anyone that would want to see the events of the 4th Great Ninja War, playing this game isn't a bad way to go about it. But that's enough about the story mode. We're here to look at gameplay in Ultimate Ninja Storm 3. Storm 3 introduces yet another brand new mechanic that drastically altered the game, but this time it was only for certain characters. Instant Awakening. When you flick the right stick, these characters can instantly enter Awakening, even from the very beginning of the match. This sounds insane, and it kind of is, but there is a catch. While Instant Awakening is in use, the length of the total chakra gauge will continuously deplete. Where did this strange idea for a mechanic even come from? Well, ever since Storm 2, there's been a problem with Awakenings in that they're inconsistent in power between different characters. Many characters have a generic Awakening where they simply do more damage, and that's mostly it. But the game also gives other characters an entire Voltron transformation as their Awakenings, completely altering their moveset in very powerful ways. These Awakenings, at least at this point in the series, are so evidently better than generic Awakenings that it's unfair. Enter Instant Awakening, CyberConnect 2's solution to this problem. Many of the characters with generic Awakenings are now given access to Instant Awakening, while the characters with notably stronger Awakenings are stuck with the Classic Awakening. This balances out Awakenings and doubles as an interesting way to create more diversity between characters. You could pick a character who has access to Awakening whenever they choose, or you could pick a character who needs to access it the classic way, but has a greater ability to make a comeback when doing so. It's a neat idea. Now, let me tell you why it doesn't hold up. Instant Awakening is easily better than Classic Awakening. The additional utility Instant Awakening offers is too good to pass up a lot of the time. One cool technique you can pull off with this mechanic is Jutsu cancelling. Leaving Awakening will cancel the recovery frames of just about anything, and with this, you can perform techniques that were impossible before, like double jutsus or comboing from a jutsu. This is just one of the many benefits it provides, but the real problem is that Instant Awakening's weakness isn't enough of a weakness. There may be times where you find yourself really low on your total chakra gauge, but managing the gauge isn't very difficult overall. The weakness is too negligible, while the strengths of this mechanic are far better than the strengths provided by Classic Awakening. The only thing balancing out the different types of Awakenings is the strength of each individual Awakening. If you expect to see a random Susanoo instantly appear during the middle of a match, it's not gonna happen. They're all restricted to Classic Awakening because they're so much more powerful than generic Awakenings. But unfortunately, I have to tell you that this is flawed as well. The rules for who does and who does not get access to Instant Awakening is surprisingly unclear. With the way I've described it, you'd think that there's a consistency to who gets Instant Awakening and who doesn't. Many of the most powerful Awakenings I can immediately think of are rightfully restricted to Classic Awakening, but then I stumble across a character like Konoha, who has what I consider to be one of the most powerful Awakenings in the game. Her moveset changes and her move speed is buffed to insane heights. So why is this an Instant Awakening? Konoha is one of the most obnoxious characters in this game, who can access and exit a really strong Awakening whenever she wants. This mechanic granted her far too much flexibility, so here she is running away the entire game with ease. There are similar cases to this in characters like Naruto and Minato and some others. Meanwhile, characters that still have generic, weaker Awakenings like Shikamaru have it locked behind Classic Awakening. With balancing like this, characters like Shikamaru feel underwhelming and picking them feels like handicapping yourself. Although, I will give the mechanic some credit, because it's a lot of fun. And they've given it to characters like Lee and designed a gimmick where he becomes ridiculously powerful at the cost of draining his chakra and health gauge while in the Awakening form. It's a shame that Instant Awakening has this side effect of weakening so many characters. As an idea, the mechanic is a fun solution to the problem with Awakenings in this series, and even has the additional benefit of unlocking new techniques to mess around with. But unfortunately, the balance is getting in the way of its potential. The inconsistent selection of who does and who does not have an Instant Awakening bolsters some characters to ridiculous strengths while damning others to complete irrelevance. Storm 3 has some other changes worth mentioning. The game introduces the ability to stop your chakra dash partway through pressing the guard button. The lower commitment on the move made it far more usable. However, the air chakra dash is still much more powerful. It's faster and safer, but more importantly, it leaves you in a better position than the ground chakra dash if the opponent guards. Ground chakra dash is now very minus on block. That's kind of a fighting game community term, so what I mean is, when a chakra dash is guarded, if both players hit a button as soon as possible, the one who guarded will act first and win the exchange. This is what I wanted several games ago so that chakra dash wasn't an easy way to skip neutral. Yet, the air chakra dash has rained on my parade and made this accomplishment irrelevant. On top of being faster and harder to punish than the ground chakra dash, the frame advantage is also better and feels akin to the chakra dash of the first Storm game. If you wander around the competitive Storm community and see Storm 3 described as a chase simulator, this is why. That's Storm 3. Instant Awakening is pretty out there as a new idea and definitely needs some adjustments, but for a first implementation, they did a pretty good job. And then they made Revolution. This is the first Storm game designed with competitive play in mind. They even claim to have spoken to a fighting game expert while designing the new system. Revolution was marketed as featuring a revamped battle system, which I imagine they had no choice but to do since there's little other reason to pay full price for this game. It doesn't offer a real story mode, but instead has mini side stories that give you a look into the background of side characters. And it has Mecha Naruto, I guess. A few reviews claim that the game is just a cash grab with not enough content to justify the full price, but luckily, because this video is centered on the gameplay, all of these things about the game will escape real criticism from me. Revolution does live up to its description of having a revamped battle system, but before I go into detail on the bigger changes, I just want to quickly mention that both chakra dashes have been altered for the better. Air chakra dash is nerfed and has slower speed, while ground chakra dash has been buffed and can chase airborne opponents. Now, onto the bigger changes. I'll let Matsuyama explain this one. Oh, wrong clip, sorry.
はい、皆さんこんにちは、サイバーコネクト2松山でございます、今回はですねこちらナルト疾風伝ナルティメットストームレボリューションの、ご紹介でございます、今回、バトルシステムっていうものを、一新しました。なんだかんだね、対戦、アクションゲームになりますので、やっぱ長く、遊んでいただくためにですね、バトルの駆け引きっていうものに、今回は重点を置いてですね、今まで1人のキャラクターの中に何でも入ってたんですけども、今回は、3つのバトルスタイルっていうものを、プレイヤーが、自ら、切り替えて遊ぶことができます。なので、1人のキャラクター、例えばナルトでも、奥義型と、覚醒型と、ドライブ型と、3つのバトルスタイルが選べるようになってますね。で、特にやっぱ今回ね、このバトルシステムを作るにあたってですね、我々もサイバーコネクトとずっとねナルトゲーム作ってきてるっていうのもあるんですけども、より対戦の駆け引きを高度にね、楽しんでいただくために、サイバーコネクト2の外部から、いわゆる対戦格闘ゲームに、精通した方っていうのをねお招きしまして、そういった方々と一緒に、ちょっと今回新しい、バトルシステムを構築することができましたんで、きっとね、戦略的な駆け引き含め長く、楽しんでもらえる、バトルシステムになっていると、思います。ぜひ触ってみてください。
This is a huge change to Storm's gameplay. Before a match begins, you need to pick from one of 3 different team types, the 3 being Ultimate Jutsu type, Awakening type, and Drive type. Judging from the names of these types, can you guess how they've revamped the gameplay in Revolution? Seriously, take a guess. It might be exactly what you think. Well, yes, they looked at all the mechanics, brought out a knife, and sliced them up into different modes. Ultimate Jutsus are only available if you choose Ultimate Jutsu type, and you won't have access to any kind of Awakening or support drives. The same bonkers restriction applies to the other types. If you choose Awakening type, you'll have access to Instant Awakening from the beginning of the match and also have access to True Awakenings later on. But as it goes, picking this type means having no Ultimate Jutsus and no support drives. And finally, in Drive type, your supports can perform all of the additional functions that Attack type, Guard type, and Balance type provides. However, you can never enter Awakening or use an Ultimate Jutsu. What the hell? What is this game? Where to start? This is the 5th entry into the Storm series. This entire time, we've had Ultimate Jutsus, Awakenings, and Support Drives all in one moveset, and the series managed to bring itself to a point where it was far from the perfect competitive game, but it was competitively viable. Admittedly, the longevity wasn't all the way there. However, splicing up the mechanics into different battle types so that the player had even less to work with while in a match was not a good solution. I know Matsuyama stated that this change was made to increase the longevity of the game, but I think that the direction he took this game in is a prime example of how not to increase your game's longevity. He was aiming for depth, a prime ingredient for increasing a fighting game's longevity. If your fighting game has depth, you'll still be hooked 100 hours in when you're still discovering new things you hadn't thought of before. Depth is a complicated thing to explain, and even more complicated to achieve. After analysing fighting games a few times on this channel, I've come to see good depth be present in fighting games when that game has mechanics that evolve alongside your growth as a player. The way I often see this achieved is through having individual mechanics that can achieve multiple goals. A great example of this is found with the Roman cancels in Guilty Gear. They can be used to cancel the recovery of your attacks, which can bolster your offense, defense, and your neutral in too many ways to count. I think a great sign that there's a lot of depth to a game is when you can witness a lot of unique interactions happening while watching top level play that you've never witnessed at lower levels. If you've ever watched a top level match and thought, wow, I never thought to use this tool like that, the game probably has a considerable amount of depth to it. When a mechanic is so open that it can facilitate a lot of different strategies around it that a player may think of, you have depth. And mechanics aren't the only way of bringing depth to a fighting game. There are some out there that are barren mechanics but achieve depth through how characters are designed. But with a game like Storm that benefits from having everybody play similarly, remember, casual audience, mechanical depth is really their only option if they want to add depth to the game. Storm lacked depth because the mechanics barely evolved with the player. The way you saw top players using Chakra Dash, Substitution, and other mechanics didn't look so different from the way everyone else used them. There were other elements of their play that set them apart from the rest, and mastery over the mechanics is one of those ways, but they were never doing anything I hadn't seen before. Revolution's attempt at achieving depth and increasing longevity misses the mark because, well, you pissed us off by taking our tools away, and nothing about this new mechanic has the potential to evolve alongside the player. Whether a player has Revolution for 2 hours or for 200, the gameplay is not going to look any different just because of team types. I don't see team types as real depth. I see a surface level attempt to introduce choice to the player, and preferably, I don't want my decision making around a system mechanic to happen before the actual fighting game fight has begun. I want it to be during the fight. I want to have active decision making that differs depending on my opponent's decision making and the current state of the game. Funnily enough, I think Storm 3 has more longevity than Revolution. Though it was likely unintended, the recovery cancel from Instant Awakening gave me new ideas to experiment with, even after I was several hours into the game. Here is where I actually did see other players using the mechanic in ways I hadn't thought of before. Technically, Instant Awakening is still here in Revolution, and now everyone has it, but it's lame that you'll have to play without drive types and ultimate jutsus in order to use it. Team types are awful and everyone hates it. In regards to less hated additions to Revolution, there are 2 other new mechanics, Guard Break and Counter Attack. Guard Break is a short linear dash that'll break the opponent's guard. You have a maximum of 2 uses, so you better make each one count. It's a nicely balanced way to instantly break someone's guard if they're not paying attention, or if you can induce enough fear to make them stand still and guard. The stun that Guard Break inflicts prevents substitutions or support calls for a short while, so you'll be able to perform a full combo or, if you chose the type, an ultimate jutsu. Then there's Counter Attack. By pressing a combination of the guard and shuriken button, you'll flash and perform a counter. If the opponent hits the counter with a melee attack or chakra dash, they'll be inflicted with the same stun that Guard Break inflicts, except it lasts way longer. Counter Attack will shave off a good chunk of your total chakra gauge whenever it's used, and it doesn't regenerate all too quickly, so it should be used sparingly. It's well implemented, to an extent. This mechanic has reasonably tight timing, which is a good thing. However, people take issue with the lengthy stun it inflicts. Now, I can't faithfully provide my own opinion on the mechanic because I didn't play much of Revolution, but from research, everybody despised the length of stun it inflicted. Although they slightly fumbled the execution, adding a new defensive mechanic was a great idea. Storm has always been an extremely aggressive fighting game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but any mechanic they add that causes a player to hesitate instead of immediately slamming Chakra Dash is a mechanic that I can appreciate. I can't faithfully speak to how this mechanic felt in practice. All I can say is that if casual players and competitive players had one thing in common, it was that they hated the stun. You know, it's a shame. CyberConnect 2 has been persistent in trying to improve the gameplay of the Storm series through new mechanics, and sometimes they've succeeded, but Revolution was undeniably a failure. This was the one game that they explicitly said they wanted to better their game, make it more competitive and increase longevity, and they even brought in fighting game experts. But the result? Rejection from longtime fans. Indeed, a revolution for the series, but not one that changed anything for the better. And you know, trying something completely new, like what Revolution did, is always going to be risky, and you can't predict how people will take it. It's actually kind of normal to not get it right on the first try. I can think of more than a few competitive fighting games that didn't get it right on the first try, but through listening to feedback and continuous updates to their game, they grew into something that everybody loves. As their first shot at trying to make the Storm series more competitive, it's okay that they didn't ace it immediately. What's important is that they listen to feedback, make necessary adjustments, and improve their game. So with that in mind, let's see what happened for Storm 4. Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, the series finale. This is CyberConnect 2's chance to right what went wrong. Revolution was a bold attempt at catapulting this series to new heights, but they didn't come anywhere near to reaching their goal. You're not going to get it right on your first try, but Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 is CyberConnect 2's second chance. How will they choose to move on from Revolution?
So in Storm Revolution, there were 3 different battle types. And that was, you're laughing. And that was new, right? And so some people liked it, some people had some feedback. How is that going to be adjusted for Storm 4?
はい、もう分かりましたよ。もう散々世界中から言われたからね、よかれと思ってさ、いろいろ新しくしようと思って3つのタイプとかね選べるようにして、なんか同じナルトでもなんか違う戦い方ができるかなと思ってやったらさ、結構みんないやいや違うやろと。奥義も覚醒もドライブも全部使えてなんぼやろっていうのを散々言われましたんで、はい分かりました、戻します。なんでストーム4ではね、もう奥義も覚醒もドライブももう分かれてない。
Yeah, I think Matsuyama heard enough of how everyone hated the direction he went in with Revolution. So for Storm 4, he reverted the idea and took us back to when we had Ultimate Jutsus, Awakenings and Support Drives all in one moveset. Yet, Storm 4 is unlike any other entry in the series, which I think is saying something, considering Storm loved to feel like a completely different game in each release. What Storm 4 has over all the others is that it's the first and only Storm game built for next-gen consoles, which back then meant PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. What makes that so great is that they took advantage of the new specifications they were able to work with, and the new idea they came up with is just great. Storm 3's big seller was Instant Awakening, and Storm Revolution's was Team Types. Storm 4's big seller is the leader change system. Up until now, teams have been restricted to one designated leader and their supports. With the new leader change system, you can switch your leaders and supports around during a match instantaneously. At the character select screen, you used to pick the one character you wanted to play. This time, you pick 3. You can go from blowing bubbles to throwing rocks in a matter of seconds. They took the route opposite to Revolution. Instead of cutting up the movesets, they let you change between 3 different ones during a match. It's fantastic, it's fun, and it's engaging. But there's more, because Leader Change blew Storm 4 wide open, in the best way possible. The real treasure to be found with Leader Change is in how the characters change around. If you're just running around, changing between characters will look like any old tag game switcheroo. However, if you leader change during certain attacks, the new leader will instantly jump in, but the old leader is still allowed to finish performing their attack before they leave. Street Fighter X Tekken fans, BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle fans, this one's for you. Some of you may be thinking, what's so special about that? My answer is that this has now opened up an abundance of new techniques that players can employ. Imagine using leader change to turn Chakra Dash and its great tracking into a long-range sniping tool. Or imagine using leader change to layer your approach and overwhelm your opponent. You could use leader change to teleport your position in neutral and catch your opponent by surprise. Or maybe you want the active frames from Orochimaru's jutsu to constantly pressure your opponent. Or maybe you just like leader change because you want the chance to blow some bubbles with Utakata whenever the opponent is far away, without the commitment of having to stay on this character whenever the opponent gets closer, like in any other Storm game. I wouldn't dare try and put a number on the different ways the mechanic can be used. People are still figuring out new ways to take advantage of the mechanic today, and that's why I think leader change is golden. This one change has kicked open a door to so many possibilities. But wait, my appreciation of the mechanic doesn't stop there. Remember what I said during the halfway point of the video when we were focusing on archetypes and I said that characters don't feel unique in this series? Well, leader change doesn't solve this issue, but it contributes to solving the issue by bringing in more roles to fill. Picking characters is no longer only about the leader and their suitable supports, it can also be about who's good at leader change teleport tricks, or who's got jutsus that can be performed in the air. Parts of characters' movesets that were previously ignored can now have a whole new purpose, often in a way that lets them stand out as unique. If Matsuyama wanted his final Storm game to have longevity, this was an amazing way to go about it. He's opened up the door for us to dive in and see what we can find. Not only has it added a mountain of depth to the game, more importantly, it's just so damn fun. And he got the mechanic right on his first try. Great stuff, Matsuyama. Storm 4 also came with other notable adjustments. For instance, there are now multiple rounds in a match. Basically, everybody has double the amount of life gauge that they had before. But in Storm 4, winning a round is more of an indicator that you're halfway through the opponent's life gauge. Your own life gauge isn't going to regenerate at all, the match pretty much just continues. Think of it like taking a stock in Smash Bros. This is kind of a big change, yet it kind of isn't. Of course, it's a big thing when your fighting game that's been a certain way for years now suddenly operates in rounds, but in practice, it's weirdly negligible. This change didn't affect much, it mainly doubled the length of a match in Storm 4, but it's not like matches were short before. I don't know why Matsuyama did this, and I can't find any explanation in his interviews as to why, but it's here now, and Storm matches are now pretty long. The one problem it does create is that there are times where someone can be up around but still enter Awakening despite being in the lead because their first health gauge is low. This isn't how your comeback mechanic is supposed to work, this is just extending the winner's lead. They try to negate this by locking out Awakening for 15 in-game seconds at the beginning of a new round, but it's not that hard for a player to outlast that timer. However, there are some tournaments with rules that limit Awakenings to a one-time use. With rules like these, using Awakening when you're just barely a round up could come back to bite you in the future. Awakenings are now a bit more interesting too, now that they've put in the effort to giving most characters unique additional skills to use once awakened. Before, it was unsatisfying to have an Awakening that wasn't special in any way and just provided a generic damage buff. This new feature was long overdue, but better late than never, right? It still isn't as great as what Instant Awakening provided, but it's definitely still something. If only they'd give their characters more unique skills outside of Awakening, am I right? Support drives have also been reworked in Storm 4. Say goodbye to Attack type, Guard type, and Balance type because that long-standing mechanic is gone. They've chopped up the several features that these types all had and assigned everyone in the roster one dedicated support ability. You can no longer choose what additional features your support will do. If you pick Tamari, you get Cover Fire and nothing else. If you pick Choji, you get Dash Cut. If you pick Pain, you get Strike Back, which is why everybody picks Pain. I wonder why Neji's is taking the hit for the ultimate jutsu. Oh, my first instinct is to say that this is a bit of a rain on the Freedom Parade, and it technically is, but it's largely negated by all the freedom that leader change now provides. Your supports are no longer just characters that do a jutsu and then strike back or dash cut. Those features mattered a lot more when that was all that they could be, but it's a lot less relevant when your supports are now capable of doing so much more. Properties like strike back are still quite valuable, so this new restriction does affect team building, but outside of intense optimization, this change, while still a negative one, isn't much of an issue. Finally, they heard the community's cries about counter and adjusted it in Storm 4. It no longer inflicts stun, but instead knocks the opponent away with a blast that they are unable to substitute. It's a great defensive tool that'll give you a necessary moment to breathe if used correctly, instead of a way to knock half of your opponent's life gauge off. And then, well, that's it. This is Storm 4, and this is the end of the series. Congratulations, Matsuyama. Through a long 6-game journey, you took the mash-heavy fighting game with zero depth and transformed it into a game with the capacity for competitive play. There were ups, and there were very low downs, but in the end, the Storm series ended in a fantastic place, and Matsuyama got what he wanted, a fighting game that people are playing competitively. So, before I jump right into discovering competitive Storm 4, I want to quickly demonstrate just how far we've come. We've started with Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm, where the ultimate jutsus were like an explosion, a huge weapon, or a bunch of punches and kicks, and now we've reached Storm 4, where an ultimate jutsu is a barrage of earth-destroying meteors, and they all do the same damage. Wow. The process of discovering competitive Storm 4 requires a bit more effort than most fighting games, both on the player and spectator side. If I search up Street Fighter Tournament on YouTube, the first results are recent top 8s and a region battle from a couple of years ago. If I search up Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 tournament, I get a bunch of the same tournament from years ago when nobody knew how to play. For some reason it has millions of views. It's not easy to stumble across the competitive scene for Storm 4. Other niche games receive exposure from fighting game tournaments that run several games and bring several communities together. In fact, the only reason I know about Clash of Ninja's competitive scene is because it makes appearances at prominent fighting game tournaments like Combo Breaker and CEO Otaku. I tune into these tournaments for some Guilty Gear or something, but I come across some interesting games on the side. However, since this arena fighter almost never makes an appearance, it's hard for players to even know that this game has a competitive scene. During the process of writing this video, Storm 4 actually did make an appearance at East Coast Throwdown 2022 as a community event. This was good exposure for their scene, or at least it would have been. Unfortunately, unforeseen problems meant that there was no stream. From a spectator standpoint, Storm 4 was never there at all. Discovering competitive Storm 4 is never an accident, it's a conscious decision. But now that I've found it, here's what I can tell you. If you have miraculously stuck with me up until this point in the video, we've learned about many of the different decisions being made during your average Storm match. We know about the intricacies to how you navigate neutral with Chakra Dash, the way that supports affect a match, the resource management of Chakra and substitution, the strategy behind the use of substitution, and how a person may structure their offense around it. We know about counter, we know about guard break, and we know about the possibilities granted through leader change. There's plenty of mechanics to master, and competitive Storm 4 is indeed an intense optimization of these mechanics. Top level Storm 4 isn't a super different game. Watching it, you'll often see the same gameplay loop taking place that you see at lower levels. However, what sets them apart is a nuance that can be hard to notice with the naked eye. That's why it's time for... I'm keeping this one short. Ironic, I know. In a first to 10 set between two strong players, Playco and Waves, one game is brought to an end by Shino's bugs. From the outside looking in, it's a little strange to see a player brought to their knees by simple projectiles, but what actually happened here is that Waves ended up in a terrible situation with Naruto. The strength of a character's shuriken is often ignored at lower levels because shuriken always loses to Chakra Dash. This causes players to forget that, if the opponent does run out of chakra, what the hell can the opponent do? We see that in this clip. It's a close game, and they're both low on health. So, Playco opts to harass Waves with the bugs because the threat of Chakra Dash simply doesn't exist. Waves doesn't want to die, but has a hard time evading the bugs and has no opportunity to charge up Chakra, so they can't do anything. They're forced to use up their entire substitution gauge to evade the attack, effectively throwing the game away the moment Playco switches to a closer assault. Fun fact, even though Waves died to bugs at the very end, I'm fairly sure that this was an unblockable setup, so if Waves pressed guard instead, Naruto would have grabbed them while the bugs kept them in guard stun anyway. This is a testament to the importance of chakra management at a top level. Waves actually had a whole lot of chakra before ending up in this situation, but a few overextensions quickly drained their chakra gauge and put them in a rough situation. Take this into account as we look at the very next game. There is no second match. Well, I mean, there was a second match, but during the process of editing this video, my laptop broke, and that match died alongside my laptop. So I lost 2 hours of audio when that laptop died, but I at least managed to keep most of the footage. Unfortunately, the second match of the analysis was not part of the footage that managed to survive. So instead, how about we just quickly analyze a match that I played in instead? We'll start from the moment where my opponent uses Rasengan in midair to pressure me. After I guard it, I try to grab him thinking he'll start guarding, but he protects himself with a well-placed rotation from Neji, forcing me to use my last available substitution, my last lifeline. I'm on just a pixel of health, and I figured that my opponent is going to do what most players do. Throw shurikens until one of them hits and kills me. And I was right. That's what they attempt to do, but I'm already prepared for this by sidestepping out of the way of these shurikens. Then I noticed something. They have no chakra. If you remember from the match between Playco and Waves, Playco only threw these many shurikens because Waves didn't have the chakra to chakra dash right through them. That's not the case here. I figure I can use the opening where my opponent is throwing shurikens to actually chakra dash at them and begin my assault. They have more substitutions than I do, but they don't have any chakra, so I feel like I'll be in a great position if I get the first hit. It's now or never. I need to start an offense eventually if I want to make the comeback. But unfortunately, my opponent stopped throwing shurikens just as soon as I had prepared to chakra dash through them, and instead they threw out Naruto's tilt attack, which beats chakra dashes. Maybe they knew exactly what I was planning, or maybe it was just a coincidence, but seeing this, I immediately double jumped to evade Naruto's tilt attack. I'm getting desperate. I need to hit him before he charges up more chakra or regenerates more substitution gauge. The moment I evade the tilt attack, I chakra dash in the air right at my opponent. And that was my biggest mistake. They were prepared for this very option, likely as soon as I'd evaded Naruto's tilt attack. They switched to Madara, and when I air chakra dash at them, they punish it with Madara's own tilt attack, a counter that actually does damage, unlike the universal one. And that's game. That was a demonstration of the nuance behind some of the decisions that are made in an instant while watching top level Storm 4. Without the right knowledge, it can definitely seem as though it's still just two players repetitively chakra dashing at each other, but that isn't true. I think a game like Storm is worse than many other fighting games from a spectator point of view. You won't know a lot of the details behind every decision made in traditional fighting games either, but it's at least kept interesting through the uniqueness of every character, the interactions of several different matchups, and the spectacle of cool combos. Spectator Storm can be slightly likened to watching a fighting game where almost everyone at the top level is playing the same character. You know, like Marvel vs. Capcom, another tag game by 18. In only a few seconds of a match, there's already several decisions that have been made that are interesting if you know the reason behind each one. However, as a spectator lacking in much knowledge, you won't know the reason behind every decision. When you watch a top 8, what you're treated to is a bunch of the same characters doing the same combos and the same mix-ups, and it can get a little boring. I don't mean to offend anyone who is good at these games, it obviously takes far more work than I'm making it sound, but it's the same case with Storm as it is with Marvel. Except, at least with Marvel, you can occasionally get treated to a character that will do things you haven't seen in a while. Storm isn't similar because people always play the same 3 characters, it's similar because, for from the outside, it looks like you're watching the same thing over and over, even if you're not. On the spectator side, this is a flaw with competitive Storm, but since Matsuyama indirectly intended for it to be this way, there's really no choice but to suck it up. The gameplay loop stays, and the only characters different enough to visibly switch things up from a spectator standpoint are all pretty weak. On the player side, there's still a lot to be intrigued by. For a person interested in improving at the game, there's a decent amount to explore, and the community has done well to push the meta. Get good enough and you'll find yourself paying attention to the smallest details, such as the range of a character's buttons, the cancel windows in their auto combos, their buffer windows for switch tech, the speed of their shurikens, their ability to gel in guard strings, how well they contribute to team synergy, the additional skills granted by their awakenings, how fast they accumulate damage in their auto combo, aka the length of their auto combo, the possibilities granted with their jutsu, and still much more. There's a lot of factors into what makes a character good or bad, and it's because you can make clear distinctions between good and bad characters that tier lists do exist for these games. And now that I've mentioned tier lists, I'm sure you want to see what one looks like, so here. In almost any Storm 4 tier list you find, you'll see a trend. There's always these characters at the top. S+ has Kaguya, Tayuya, and Tamari. These women are so strong that many tournaments have banned their use. Kaguya is an extremely unique moveset, but that moveset is too powerful. She can alter the game stages to 4 different locations at any time, and this changes the properties of her moves in the process. But her lava stage in particular is too powerful for competitive play because her buttons grant far too much screen control and do too much damage to have any place in a semi-fair competitive environment. Tayuya is the only other extremely unique character, who is also probably the closest thing that this game has to a traditional fighting game puppet character, although she's still far away. She doesn't have items, she instead has Doki beasts that do different things during a match, but these beasts are also unfair giant meat shields that just don't go away. They're like built-in dash cuts, the only banned mechanic of competitive Storm 4. I'm not surprised, the mechanic is obnoxious. It's way too good at stopping your only approach option, and it doesn't even require any input from the player to activate. I thought dash cut was a decent mechanic. All the way back in Storm 2, you know, back when you couldn't cancel chakra dash at all, and neutral was literally just 2 players chakra dashing at each other with no options to fight it. Back when we were still on that chaotic game, I could appreciate that dash cut offered some kind of defense against the overpowered chakra dash. But now that we've made it to Storm 4 and there are many ways to punish reckless chakra dashes, dash cut has no place here, especially since it requires no skill from the individual player. It's too potent and strong, and I'm glad to see it gone. So Tayuya and her Doki demons can't stay either. Tamari is here pretty much because her cover fire projectiles are crazy good and will buff the hell out of any character she's supporting. It has insane hit stun and creates so many pseudo infinites, it has super high guard stun and does a bunch of guard damage, and its range is enormous. Tamari isn't that threatening at all when she's taking the lead, but as a support character, she's deemed to be too much by some of the community. The S rank usually consists of the strongest characters that might not be banned in tournaments. Emphasis on might. Here, we often have Neji, Nagato, Yugito, Madara, and Danzo. You can see the qualities that the meta values in these characters, like with Neji, the startup of his buttons are fast, he's quick to be able to jump cancel during his auto combo, he has an infinite, and he has a jutsu that pairs well with leader change switching. Nagato and Yugito are similarly fast with their buttons, and they have great tilt attacks too. Yugito might have the best tilt attack in the game, it's an amazing defensive option, and Nagato's tilt is also amazing, it's Almighty Pull, which is a super powerful button for space control. Danzo and Madara have very powerful awakenings. Danzo's awakening has an instant kill, and Madara's awakening grants him unparalleled screen control. The A tier will often have standout features that are strong, but not ridiculous to fight against. Pain is valuable for being a fundamentally solid character that has a pretty useful jutsu in Almighty Push, great active defense button, and he's also a character that has Strike Back. It also helps that Almighty Push actually triggers Strike Back. You'll see Pain on many teams if the tournament has banned all the other better characters. Mei's auto combo has some tracking water shots that are great for zoning because they beat Chakra Dash, and she also has a very active jutsu that pairs well with switch tech. Orochimaru is probably here solely because of how well his jutsu pairs with switch tech. The giant snake is a long-lasting and huge active hitbox that grants great screen control, and there are some nice teleport shenanigans with it too. I found out a lot of these details thanks to Storm YouTubers, channels like Mr. Air Force 464 and Poisoned Okami, whom both cover competitive Storm, with the former having a plethora of tournaments and exhibitions available on the channel, and the latter showcasing a variety of content like character guides or general online play. These are the two I relied on the most, but there are other Storm YouTubers out there as well. It's just a shame that none of these guys are easily discoverable through a basic YouTube search. As always, the best way to really get engrossed in competitive Storm 4 is to join the Discord. This is the home of competitive Storm 4, and it's also the only way to play EVO. As I mentioned before, Naruto Storm 4 has a community mod with changes designed to make the game more competitive. This mod is known as Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 Evolution, or EVO. EVO isn't completely finished, but it's completely playable. You'll know you're watching EVO if you see the health gauge split into parts, but without that, you'd struggle to know unless you've seen the list of changes for the mod. I'll cover the most important ones. Dash cut is gone, it's fully gone and I don't think anyone misses it. Counter has been modified, by which they mean you can't cheat your way out of the risk factor by switching lead in case you get baited. They reduced the minimum online delay from 2 frames to 1 frame, and they removed ring out. I never mentioned this mechanic, did I? Okay, really quickly. Storm 3 went a bit Soul Calibur and introduced stages that have ring out features. If you shatter the same area on the wall twice, the next time you're thrown into it, you instantly lose. Or in the case of Storm 4, you knock half of your opponent's life gauge off. The competitive Storm community seemingly doesn't enjoy this, which is why it's completely gone for EVO. There are several detailed changes that have been made for this mod, all voted for by the community, but I won't cover each and every change. From all the recent Storm footage I could find, most tournaments are still running on the base version of Storm 4. However, EVO has had a few tournaments of its own. As the mod continues to be updated, I think the community will see more and more tournaments happen on the mod. PS4 players may have to consider switching over to PC, but hey, with the state of the FGC right now, switching over to PC is probably the most fighting game thing you could do. It's really nice to see the community take the game into their own hands and make the improvements that the developers are definitely not going to make. Matsuyama is gone. I don't know whether that was his choice or not, but Storm players received 1 or 2 DLC packs and then were abandoned. Alright, I'm being a little dramatic. Technically, they were abandoned, but base Storm 4 is a good game. There are some glitches here and there, the netcode is mediocre, some characters are a bit broken on the optional 60 FPS, and by broken, I don't mean they're really strong, I mean they literally aren't functioning correctly, but Storm 4 is fine. It is because the game is fine, yet these players still took the time to improve it, that I respect this mod and these people so much. I can't dedicate that much time to playing Storm anymore, but the little time that I would be spent on this mod. This deep dive into the Ultimate Ninja Storm series has been a journey started by and decorated with nostalgia. However, I can't let that blind me from providing real criticism towards the competitive aspects of this game. Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, as a competitive game, has flaws, many flaws that I'll soon list. But more importantly, after returning to this game 6 years later, my takeaway is that it's very fun and caters to the competitive fighting game side of me. I know precisely what I want out of my fighting games. Whenever I open a new one, I immediately head into training mode to see what it can do for me. Are there cool combos, unique character concepts, mechanics that I can make my own? I'm not clairvoyant, but I can often predict whether or not I'll still be playing the game a few months down the line after just a few minutes of training mode. Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 didn't check many of the boxes that some of my favourite fighting games are able to check, but it did leave me with that same feeling I have when I think I could still play a game months later, and the leader change system is largely responsible for this. It's that mechanic alone that makes me believe there are so many ideas I could explore. It's responsible for that wonderful feeling I got when I came up with an offensive strategy that looked practical, like I'd discovered this cool, secret setup through my own creativity. I later tried it out in an online match, and it worked, which felt great. I made that mechanic my own, and I wanted to explore even more. Creativity matters a lot to me, but there's more to fighting games than creativity. People like cool combos, and unfortunately, Storm 4 doesn't have any. Visually, these combos look fantastic, but they lose a lot of their luster when you realize that all of them are still just the continuous mashing of one button. Generations introduced the ability to jump cancel and sidestep, ninja move, cancel your combos, which did introduce slightly more advanced combos that look like this.
We'll go with the Kino-Shikacho combination! Lock on!
Shadow grab jutsu!
Sensory communication!
Let's go, Shojin!
To your left, Shikamaru!
Going to double again! I'm not fighting by myself. Human Boulder Yo-Yo!
The victor has been decided!
And this does take slightly more execution to make sure you get the timings right, some of which timings are surprisingly strict, but combos don't get any deeper or more varied than that. I mean, there are Storm 4 combo videos on YouTube, but auto combos are the most practical combos in this game, so that's what you'll be seeing in a match. People also like fighting games for their unique characters. I made a whole section on archetypes in this video after all. If you'll remember, Storm 4 is mostly full of characters that play the same way as each other, and the ones that don't are poorly designed or plain weak. By the time of Storm 4, there are more characters with a unique identity of their own, but not that much more. Tayuya is one of the greatest examples. She feels largely detached from the typical gameplay and plays her own game with her Doki beasts. It's super cool, but she and any other interesting characters are in the minority. The Storm series also neglects older characters. Most of them receive no updates, and if they do, it's often minor balancing changes. Giving everybody a new skill and awakening is the exception to this, but their regular movesets are the same as they were several years prior. This is one of the biggest differences between Storm 4 and traditional fighters. Traditional fighters love to give most of their characters new moves every time a new version of the game comes out. BlazBlue, for example, is a game where my main felt like an entirely new character with each new release. Okay, they did go a bit overboard with changing her all the time, but most of the roster remained as the same characters that they always were, but with fun new tools to work with that complemented their moveset. But in Storm, if you played Jugo back in Storm 2, I'm sorry, but he's still the same outdated moveset in Storm 4. And he's still stuck in this stupid prisoner outfit, despite not looking like that for most of the series. I'm sorry, Jugo, you deserved better. But he's not the only one. Poor character diversity and an emphasis on auto combos are both deal breakers for many people. In fact, those are often the first reasons that people cite as to why they may not play Storm. It's understandable. But despite this, Storm 4 still holds up as a competitive fighting game and a fun time. I'm playing a neutral that makes sense to me. I can understand why I win neutral, as well as understanding what I could have done better anytime I lose neutral. I understand the importance of resource management and how it should influence my offense and defense. Nobody can tell me this game isn't competitive, and they shouldn't tell you that either. Even if I don't think it's got as much appeal as something like Guilty Gear, I still think that if the Storm community were keenly interested, this game could have its own little corner at fighting game events. The potential is there, but I guess it's up to the community to put themselves out there. Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 is an arena fighter, but is somehow also a competitive fighting game. Can you believe it?